about going in space. It was just about curiosity. It was when I was 6 or 7 years old, 6 and 7, maybe around that age group. I was so fascinated by the night sky that I would go outside and sit on the trunk of my dad's car most nights and just look up and just wondered what those, what those bright lights were. What was that? I just didn't have a concept for what our, like our planet Earth, and there's a whole universe and stuff like that. I didn't have that concept. I just had a fascination and a curiosity about what was out there. So that was it. I mean, yeah, growing up in Trinidad and Tobago in the 70s, that's not something that was ever in the consciousness. So being a really great student in math and science in high school, and I think part of what is pivotal about my journey is the education system in Trinidad and what I had access to. Being in an all-girls school, I went to St. Francois Girls College. So being in an all-girls school oftentimes allows you to self-actualize, right? It allows you to dream big, and you are encouraged oftentimes to pursue whatever you want. In a co-educational system, sometimes we have these biases like, oh, the boys should do math and science. I know in the US that is very much a thing. More boys are encouraged than girls to do math and the science. But in an all-girl environment, I think for me, that really helped me. So I did all the sciences. It was a few of us. It was 10 of us in that in our graduating class who did all the sciences back then. I think a lot more girls are excited about doing sciences at O levels and A levels or CAPE or whatever it is. And so at the time, and I think it's still a thing now, where parents are like, you can be a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, an accountant, or a nurse. Like those were the only professions that existed, right? And my parents were no different. And I was like, I don't want to do any of that. I was like in this inquiry in high school of like, what do I want to do when I grow up? And I was like, I don't want to do any of that. I hate the sight of blood. I'm certainly not going to go to med school. I wasn't going to do dissections and stuff like that. But we had a family friend who was an engineer. And I'm talking about this because it seems so commonplace now, but back then it wasn't. We're talking early 70s, right? So we had a family friend who was an engineer, and he was a petroleum engineer. And I remember thinking, I don't know what an engineer does, but I know that this is something different. I don't know anybody else who's an engineer. This is quite unique. And so I remember asking my mom if he makes a lot of money, and she said yes. I'm like, definitely I'm doing that, But then I realized that math and science were the foundational subjects for being an engineer. And so since I was already doing math and science, doing well at math and science and loving it, I was like, oh, I could take this foundational stuff I have and parlay it into going to study engineering. But then I was like, okay, what type of engineering do I want to be? Like, I love chemistry. I could do chemical engineering. I could clearly do petroleum engineering because I'm in Trinidad. I could come back and do that. But I also love planes because we would travel to the US often. I started flying on a plane when I was 5 years old. So I became really fascinated by what these machines were. How do you design? Like, what is this, right? And so it was my love for planes that had me decide that I wanted to study aeronautical engineering, which is the study of the design of planes. And so when I migrated to college, that's what I was studying. As a little side note, I was one of those young people who, you talk about being driven. I really acquired that over my young life. I always wanted to pursue things that nobody else did or not many people did. I always subconsciously wanted to pave paths that were the least traveled. And so taking on aeronautical engineering was like, I didn't know anybody who did that. So I was like, I'm doing that. That sounds hard and I'm going to do it. You know? But when I was a freshman, my first year in college is when the Space Shuttle Challenger accident happened, killing the 7 astronauts on board, January 28th, 1986. I came home from school and it was all over the news. And I tell you, that was one of the most pivotal moments in my life. Because before then, I had just left Trinidad, like 6 months before. I didn't know there was a place called NASA. I didn't know there was a thing called a space shuttle. And I certainly didn't know there was a job that you could fly in space. We weren't exposed to that back then. And so in that moment, even in the tragedy of what happened, my mind was blown. I was like, whoa, that's what I want to do. I don't want to design planes. I want to design rockets. I want to work at NASA. I want to be an astronaut. And so I just switched my major a little bit. I was still doing engineering, but I switched to aerospace and mechanical. And 6 years after that, I was driving into the gates of NASA at Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And that was 30 something years ago and hadn't looked back since. I left NASA for a few years and worked at the Department of Defense and worked on, ballistic missiles, protecting people. And for me, it was still using my skills and what I loved. I have had many mentors over the course of my career. I would say he was definitely a role model early on, like someone who was doing that job. And someone I could model myself after, I would say yes, for sure.
Okay. Did you get any female mentors or role models?
Not early on. Not early. Besides my mom, who I am as driven, I'm driven because of her. I was telling her today, but the courage and resilience and strength that I have is definitely because of her. So the foundation she laid and my dad laid for me early on definitely is what is part of the essence of who I am, right? So for sure her. But over the course of my career, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I've had not mentors, but role models for sure. The women who were part of the Hidden Figures story at the time. They were at NASA before I got there, but definitely what they went through and their resilience and their, tenacity to just really break down the barriers is definitely the things that paved the way for me to be able to do what I've done. I don't think they understood it. I don't think they understood it. It's only in the last few years, my mom is still alive. She's 93 years old. My dad is since passed. I don't think they understood it. They just knew I was studying engineering. And honestly, I didn't understand it. I didn't understand what was ahead of me. If you told me 20 years ago that I would have done all the things I've done, I would have been like, are you kidding? How is that going to be possible? So I didn't understand it. It's really only in the last 15 years that it's really like, whoa, like Camille, you've really been blazing trails, So I don't think they understood it, but they've been always just supportive of what I've done and who I am, I came from a 2-parent household who worked outside of the home. My mom was a registered nurse. She was a public health nurse and in fact retired as the head of public health nursing for Trinidad in the 80s or the 90s. So she was fearless. You know, she went to Jamaica and she did her bachelor's degree in nursing. She came back and she would travel all over the country. You know, she was well known in you know, as one of the premier nurses back then. So yes, like she's been a force. And then my dad worked for Trinidad, and so he did well there too. So I had two parents who worked hard, and their thing was education. I'm one of three girls. I'm the last of three girls, and they were like, education is the most important thing, because you are girls, you're going to be young women in this world, and you need to be able to be self-sufficient. And so getting your education is going to allow you a life where you don't have to depend on anybody, right? And so yeah, they were great examples. They were just very humble, and you know, humble beginnings, but just powerful, powerful. I would say it's the last 10 years. So probably it took 20 years to get, I mean, I've been in this field for 30 some years. So I would say it's the last 10 years. And maybe the last 15 years globally in the Caribbean and Trinidad. But I also am recognized for the work I do empowering girls around the world and education. And so those both the stories, what I've been able to do with space, and then what I've been able to do empowering girls, those things come together. They're really powerful and people recognize it. So I would say it probably took about 20 years. I was sitting at NASA headquarters back in 2006 and starting to recognize what I was doing, right? How far I had come and how unique a position I was in as a woman, and a woman of color, and a woman of color from another country, right? I started to recognize the significance of that. And so I started to look around and I realized there were no little ones who looked like me in the pipeline. At the same time, I had taken a trip to Kenya, and I was going into schools during their summer and teaching that, you know how, and this is the same for Trinidad and the Caribbean, where we learn these subjects, we learn these really technical subjects, science, physics and math, physics and chemistry, and it's very theoretical. But we struggle with how does that actually apply to real life and the real world? So I was going into schools helping to bridge between what they were learning in the book and actual, like, this is how it applies. And I was using rockets, and we would launch paper rockets and stuff like that. And I recognized that them seeing me, someone who looks like them, the impact it had on them and the impact it had on me, frankly. So I came back, and then I was like, how do I make a difference? How do I bring more people who look like me into the world of space, into the conversation about what it means to explore space, to develop technologies, all that stuff? And the only way you could do that is through education. So I started like connecting these dots. And then I said, well, there are no girls. There are no girls in this field, or very few. How do I make a difference for improving, not improving, but actually encouraging more girls to get into space and science and technology? And so that was the vision and the mission for my foundation. Since then, it's been 16 years, and I have traveled the world, speaking, mentoring, empowering young women, young people. I mentor young men too. And really have impacted countless thousands of lives around the world, which has been one of the most fulfilling things I've done and continue to do. I just retired after 30 years, almost 30 years. And I started my own company. Talk about driven. I jumped right in from the frying pan into the fire. I started my own space company called Arusha Space. And our goal is to support the development of space programs around the world. A lot of countries now, unlike 10 years ago, are interested in space or and the uses of space or the uses of space technology and how it can help in sustainable and socioeconomic development. And so that is the cornerstone of our company, which is supporting the development throughout the world, solving global challenges using space technology, using satellites, and helping countries develop space strategies. I mean, I've always supported education, right? And supporting youth in their studies in Trinidad and Tobago. But now with my company, actually bringing these space solutions to helping to solve problems, especially like in the oil and gas sector, right? We have capabilities that you could use satellites to image things like oil exploration or oil spill. You could detect oil spills and stuff like that. We are bringing those solutions to the region.
Oh.
It was hard, but you have to do it. You always have to find balance. I had a very supportive family when I was married. And, since then, actually, I don't know how I did it. Because she was doing her thing growing up, very involved in gymnastics, as a full-time job besides her school. I was working full-time. I was pursuing my doctorate degree and raising her by myself. I actually don't even know how I did all of that. But we are resilient. I talked about that resilience and strength. She certainly has gotten that from me. And so always making sure that her well-being, and I was a mom first before I was anything. So making sure she was doing well, that I was supporting her in everything that she was up to. And, amazing. She ended up graduating a year early from high school, she has 2 Ivy League educations, one from Yale and one from Columbia, and now she's in law school at Georgetown. So I don't think I've done a bad job at all. And she's an amazing human. I would say yes, but not for that reason. I am in a male-dominated field, as you could imagine. And so there are not many women of color, especially at the leadership level that I'd risen to. I could count on one hand, honestly. And so the journey hadn't always been empowering journey, to say the least. But I think what allowed me to transcend that was knowing that I was responsible for what I brought to the table, right? And who I showed up as, regardless to what was happening around me, right? And so I always showed up as my true and authentic self. And really with a care for the people around me and the people on my team. And I think partly who I was really made a difference in how I advanced through my career, because I really made a difference for people, and so, and the times when it was isolating, I had people I could reach out to who would remind me who I was and, what I was up to and what I was there for. growing up in Trinidad and Tobago at that time, the people I was surrounded by, the people in leadership looked like me, right? So when you have those type of models, there's no limit to what you could do, because you could be the head of the country, you could be whatever, right? That really plays a part in how we are conditioned and our psyche. So I've always had that with me, that strength. Like, I belong in the room. I belong at the table. Are you kidding? You're not. You're telling me I can be. I'm telling you, I belong here. And so I've taken that throughout my career. And so being in environments where there are not many people who look like me, whole different story, where you barely see anybody who look like you in these positions of leadership, right? That strength that I had within me that I grew up with is what allowed me to feel comfortable in those spaces when I looked around and there was no other person who looked like me. And I was still like, I belong here. It was my foundation growing up in Trinidad and Tobago that allowed that.